So thank you once again, Dr. Gratien, for joining me and doing this to help us kind of understand the situation and how best the different modules, should I say, that we've studied, or as an MBA student, I can interpret what is happening, even though there are a lot of uncertainties, just to give me light. And one thing we learned during the course is change keeps on happening, is the only constant thing in life. And so this thing is bound to happen again in a way. Um, Not maybe, hopefully, not as drastic as this, but we are hoping that we'll be much prepared in the future when a pandemic or a change happens in our organization or in the country as a whole. So thank you once again for
My
doing
pleasure.
this.
My pleasure. Yeah, my pleasure.
So first of all, how are you, Dr. Gratien, and how are you dealing with this?
I'm fine, Eugenia. I am. It's a very different change.
Mm,
Never expected it to be this drastic,
and long.
and I never thought things would happen at this rapid pace. We talk about change constantly. We always say change is inevitable, but this has been a surprise. Not just to me, I'm sure to the entire world. And well, I've enjoyed it. I'm very good at adapting to things, so I've been being calm has helped me see through things.
Mm.
Stepping back a bit, reflecting on things has helped me also to cope better. And also, as you know, I have a young daughter, and I've been able to spend more time with her. So that's been a blessing in disguise. And well, I've not had any, I wouldn't say challenges, but I've looked at this as an opportunity
Interesting.
to look at things that I wouldn't have been able to do during the normal times.
Mm.
It's also given a lot of time to reflect because, as you know, before the COVID, the world was moving at a faster pace. Even now, it's moving at even much more faster pace. But then we never had time to reflect because our time also involved um, traveling and socializing and all the other things. Now, since you're staying put at home, it's given you more time to reflect, to look at things, and also to reevaluate yourself and adapt different approaches to life.
Interesting. Yeah, that's been a challenge for I think most people. Maybe the first few weeks trying to adapt and re-strategize because most of us, and it was at the beginning of the year, you have goals set and you want to achieve them, and then this thing just hits you and you have to kind of refocus your life. I don't think it's easy, but I hope we all get through it some way, one way or the other.
That's true. I'm sure.
Yeah.
It's all about building resilience.
Mm-hmm.
It's a survival of the fittest, they say. Because once all this finishes, it's going to be a very different world we are going to see. It's not going to be the same world. So it's about people who have learned or invested their time on developing themselves. And I always encourage people to focus on developing their soft skills. And if you remember in the lectures we have had,
Yeah.
the conversations I've had with you and your fellow students, I've always encouraged you to focus and develop on your soft skills. Because we were thinking before COVID, it would be artificial intelligence taking over the world. And how do you keep yourself, still, qualified and capable of holding a job? It's about adaptability is important, resilience is important, and finding ways to reskill yourself is very, very important during this time.
Would you say ethical leadership, as we studied, is quite relevant in times like this, and how can it be beneficial?
I think ethical leadership is always a very important characteristic a leader needs to have,
Mm.
because you got to practice what you preach, and any decisions you make should be based on your values. So I don't think this pandemic is going to change how ethical leadership is going to play, but then I'm sure it's going to play even a greater role. during this time, because people are needing to have multiple support.
Yeah.
There are people who are, you know, having are going through a grieving process. People who are themselves ill, um, trying to provide a support system where people can still continue to work at home, and also, um, you know, uh, having regular conversations with their employees. I would say not just conversations or communications, I would say more interactive conversations where it's a two-way process.
Mm-hmm.
And also providing the opportunity and the facility for them to grow and evolve and develop. Because, so I think values, I think ethical leadership does play a critical role. And also, any decisions they make
Mm-hmm.
should be based on those values and principles, because people are so skeptical these days about their jobs, about their future, what's going to happen. They're talking about a lot of mental health issues.
Yeah.
So how are they going to cope with it? Because there were mental health issues, in the workplace, and people were trying to manage in terms of stress. I think this is only going to add on more to their stress and their anxiety. So how are people going to cope? Are you having mechanisms where people can, or platforms where people can talk, engage, share, or provide support? So I think leaders have a very critical part, especially being ethical and not caring about people, and developing a trusting environment where people can look up to you. If you can't, then that's going to have a huge negative impact on mental health, well-being, and the support system. And also making sure that our policies fit for purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Should be changed then. Should be changed so that it adapts to what people are doing now. So it's about constant revisiting your working practices, your policies, your regulations, and trying to fine tune it so that it fits into what people are looking for, and also engaging people in that process, not just having a top down approach, but also encouraging a more bottom up approach, and
So
so on.
more safe and democratic way of.
Absolutely. A more transformational approach to leadership. And also, um, overnight people started to work from home. So, do they have the infrastructure to work from home?
Mm-hmm.
The technology, the equipments, So, looking into all those things, I think is so important. I think it, this time is all about survival and not profitability. So, the
No.
focus should shift from a profit focused approach
Yeah.
to a much more well being,
Yeah.
approach where people can, so that as a team, you are going through it and you'll come out of it very strongly.
Yes. But I see many leaders and businesses facing challenges when it comes to maintaining your values and your vision for the company. One thing that struck out to me, a company that I know very well, they have as their vision, one of, should I say, values, they say it's people first, technology, and then profit. But whenever they face a crisis, the people suffer first,
Mm,
then their technology, but then they sort of have a life jacket for their profit. And so,
yes.
how do you maintain? Because I see a lot of people. I know businesses are facing challenges because they are being hit. Shares are going down. How are you maintaining employees when businesses is not running? So, do you have any practical kind of advice or something?
I think this is a catch 22. It's the chicken or the egg situation. It's I think everyone is learning through this
Very much.
process. And I think this learning has to happen on a day to day basis. I think you need to reevaluate your practices on a day to day basis. Fortunately, in the UK, the government has provided a furloughing system till end of July, where it's a cost neutral approach for companies. So companies can decide to furlough the employees, and the government is paying up to
Yeah.
80% of their salary to a maximum of £2,500.
Yeah.
So the companies need to decide how they can use that furloughing system. I think a lot of companies have used it, and I think it's really positively impacted on their
Mhm.
cost. I think so. That's so they have benefited from that. in a great way. But going forward, the government has also extended that following system till end of
I think
October, but
October.
then companies are required to pocket out the 50% of this cost. So that's the time it's going to be a
Yeah.
critical time for companies to make a decision and say, so what's going to happen? I think different companies across the world have taken different approaches because not everyone has the same social welfare system as the UK and other developed countries in the world.
Mhm.
So a lot of companies have suggested their employees, okay, we don't want to make you redundant, we don't want to lay you off, we want you to take a pay cut. So it could be a 30% pay cut or a 40% pay cut. Or I think if companies can look at that and create find alternative ways of working, and
Exactly.
also encouraging employees to work with them during this time, and there's clear communication, and also the whole concept of power has to be devolved. you know I would say it shouldn't be a much more organization shouldn't have a centralized approach in terms of power and control. They should try and empower the employees who can
Mm.
also work very closely with them in giving ideas, suggestions, making decisions, and taking ownership. I think companies like that, creating new ways, innovative ways of working, may probably come out much more stronger, and also trying to future proof your organization going ahead. I
Yeah.
think that can help. I think a lot of companies have not thought about it. You
Yeah.
know, they thought human resources can be easily replaced, and if you're not there, there's someone else. There's no continuity. So that really impacts on that growth, the development of the company. So I think here making employees a great part of the organization, making them as stakeholders, can really have a huge impact on how companies can approach. So I would say companies need to really be honest to themselves, honest to their employees, be more transparent, and make them understand, have a much more open book policy, so where employees also have access to what's the financial health or well-being of the company, and then he'll ask them, so what would you do? Like
Yeah.
you all did about Ricardo Simler's case study, where
Ex- ex-
where employees were even asked to fix their own
mhm.
salaries. I
Yeah.
think that might be a good interesting point here. So I think
Exactly.
everyone's got different expenses, but we can't, at least to cover the basic expenses like
And it
food,
builds
rent.
confidence, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. So if they can be realistic, and if they all can work together, and also I'm sure a lot of companies are saying they're not going to come back and have a more physical presence going forward,
Yeah.
because home working has worked well. Their employees have been very productive, very positive about it,
Hmm.
and that's the way they're going to go and work, especially smaller companies, and that's going to help them to save their costs by 10%, you know,
Hmm.
or 15%. So that's a huge, significant, cost
Exactly.
savings for the company. So I
Yeah.
think it's about working with employees, finding better ways of working, and in terms of cost, in terms of salaries, and making sure everyone is able to survive, sustain themselves, and then when things, when they cross
Hmm.
this tough time and they come out, successfully, I think they might be better organizations to be prepared, or better prepared to deal with uh, situations like this. But for this to happen, as I said earlier, trust is very important.
Trust it. So that's in businesses. I remember there was an argument with I don't know whether it was Boris Johnson and the other party leader, where he demanded for the government to list out the coming out plan, how we are going, and then he said it's too early to give people that, because when you do, uh, and things don't go as planned, you kind of mess everything up. You've lifted people's hope up, but then it's not going the way it is. So, in that sense, do you have to be too transparent to people, especially in nation building, knowing that people might interpret it different ways or might get too excited?
I think it's about being honest and being transparent. I think there's nothing wrong. So that he's always got, as a leader, he's been honest from day one. He's
Mm.
been transparent from day one. He has no control. A leader has no control on how people would interpret or see it. But at least, again, going back to your ethical stance, you know, the leader has been ethical in terms of being transparent and being honest to, you know, to his subordinates or to the citizens of the country. And I think it's about also helping, and it's about managing expectations. It's about, I think it's leaders need to manage that very well,
Yeah.
and need to tell them, like if you see in the UK they are using the R number.
Yeah, factor.
I
Yeah.
think it's a very, very clear way of telling, okay, where is the R number now? If it goes beyond one, then the infection rates are going to go up, and then we need to come back and, curtail things what we are doing. As long as we can keep it below one, then we can slowly start opening up and slowly start, building our economy. So they have a way of looking at it in order to a model or a framework which
Mm.
helps them to a more credible framework which helps them to make certain decisions.
Decisions.
So I think it's good for employees to be, so leaders to be more transparent, and also to be very clear in communicating that. And I think the media has a big role to play here. They should not bring in a twist or a spin into
Mm-hmm.
that message. I think that's what's causing more confusion and commotion in how communication is is communicated,
Yeah.
is being filtered down to different people. So I think it's always good to send a consistent message. So if that to happen, it's about being transparent and open, and also telling people, as I said about managing expectations, telling them and making them understand. Next week at this time, we may be having a very different conversation because things would have moved on.
Adoption.
So it's about taking it on a day-to-day basis and reviewing things on a daily basis, and then helping people see through that process.
Mm-hmm.
I think I wouldn't say you're going to lift, that's being, because people are honest and being transparent is not going to, as you said, as you suggested, it's not going to make them make them more over enthusiastic or more thing. But I don't think that. I think as a leader, he's got an anchor in terms of being honest and being transparent, and
Okay.
it's about credibility building. So I think if
Okay.
that credibility is built, I think people will trust you more. I
Okay.
think if leaders didn't have that credibility prior to the crisis, they're going to struggle. So even if they're being honest and transparent, people are still going to question that
Mhm.
approach, that process. So,
Exactly.
so for example, if you see in the UK, they want to open all the schools up on the 1st of June. There are a lot of debates, a lot of arguments. If you talk to people who have kids who are going to school, do I want to send my kid? Do I want to put my kid in that position? People who are not in that circumstances may look at it very differently and say, no, kids need to go to school. They're going to be so bored. They're talking about they're talking about nutrition and all those
Yeah.
things for people who are on low income, who are from low income
Mm-hmm.
families. So they feel those kids would benefit. But then again, they have to look at, take a much more universal approach. And what is it? Is our system ready enough to cope?
Yeah.
Can kids cope? Do they know what social distancing is this the right decision to be made? I think leaders need to be realistic about decision making and also listening to people. This is what we are thinking. What do you think? I think having a consultation could help. I think
Mm.
I think government does have consultations on some of the issues. So
Yeah.
I think this is a very important issue, not only for the government but also for the people, because anything they do is. So I
Exactly.
think having a more consultative approach and saying, okay, what needs to be done, what are the priorities,
Mm-hmm.
and I think doing some groundwork. It takes time, and
Yes.
I think if they can approach it in a much more systematic way, I'm sure they're not going to get perfectly right, but at least they know if things go wrong, where it's going wrong, so what they should be doing, and so on, instead of jumping from one branch to another branch and not knowing, confused.
Exactly.
And I think
I
the
think. Yeah.
Prime Minister very correctly said he himself is very confused yesterday in one of his media, in one
That's
of his
that's.
interviews, that he himself, you can't blame him totally. He's going on advice, and it is difficult for him also. I think it's not easy to be a leader during these times.
True. I don't think anybody wants to be in the shoes of any leader at this
Absolutely,
time.
Absolutely.
Seriously, because you are fighting an enemy you don't fully know or understand, and
That,
everything that you do, there's a consequence to that.
that's true.
And I think that's where people have to also realize that we are all stakeholders in this situation and not just leave things for one leader to kind of take us to the promised land, or should I say,
Absolutely,
something like that.
absolutely.
Yeah.
That's
But
that's
then,
what that's what they talk about leadership in small and medium-sized enterprises
mm,
is about devolving that leadership across different levels and getting employees at those different levels to take ownership and leadership and to demonstrate leadership in
mm,
order to manage how they work and how they perform and how they do business. So that way they'll have a much more huge impact. So I think it's about uh, maybe in this time of need or crisis, I think that's what you need, I guess. It's about trying to empower people, devolve that responsibility. I'm sure the government here in the UK is doing that with local governments and all those things, but also giving them a free hand in doing things, but having clear guidance, policies, and guidelines. So that's what you can see. The R rate is not consistent across the whole country. It is different, and so I think it's a good opportunity for even other leaders across the country to even have a look. Why are some of the regions doing better than
yeah.
us? So what can we do? And it's about learning from each other. I think
Mm,
it's about knowledge sharing. I think this is so
just-
important. I think to communicate, to ask. I think it's no harm in asking for help.
mm,
Or shouting out, "I'm struggling with this." I think at the end of the day, even leaders are human beings. So I think if you have a much more, if you have a humble approach, I'm sure it's going to, really help people in the long run as leaders.
Okay. So we've seen different strategies from different leaders across the globe because this is like a global pandemic and
Yeah,
it's affecting everything, economy, the health, the public sector, social life, everything. Some leaders are kind of quick and decisive. Others are waiting on more information, they say. And in times like this, how can you judge the effectiveness of a leader? Do you do that by the consequence or the result of their actions or by morally how they kind of follow logic, should I say? How would you judge a leader?
I think during this time, as you said very correctly, it's the unknown.
Mm,
Leaders need to trust experts. So, in this case, the scientists. They need to give them autonomy. I think there should not be any political interference in this. And you need to allow groups of people who are experts working in different areas to take control of or to take ownership of what they're doing and enable them to give impartial, practical, honest advice to leaders.
mm,
I think if they can do that way, leaders are in a better place to try and make the right decisions. At the end of the day, yes, your the bottom line is the key thing. You will be judged based on your performance. You will be judged based on the how many people sadly passed away
mm,
because of this pandemic, how many people were directly or indirectly impacted because of this, how many people have lost their jobs, how many businesses are staying afloat, what did the governments do, did they engage with them in
yeah,
conversations, because not all the time financial aid is going to help, because at some point that package is going to evaporate, that funding is going to evaporate. How can we provide more sustainable help and support to organizations and to people? you know so that's what we talk about, aid to Africa. I'm sure you're very well versed with this. It's not always about giving aid, it's about equipping people so that they could be more self-reliant and self-sufficient.
mm,
So I think governments need to have that sort of a conversation with companies, encourage them to, make them understand and work with experts in those areas or leading figures to help them create a much more sustainable approach to a business, and also to communities. So that will help them going forward in terms of making those decisions. I think a leader we will have to play a critical role here. I think, again, going back to what we said about communication, keeping
Yeah.
that communication very clear, and also communicating to different stakeholders who are impacted. Is it the airline industry? Are you talking about the automobile industry? Are you talking about hospitals? Are you talking about the housing market? Are you talking about the financial sector, the banks, and so on? So who are you talking about? Or are you talking about people, or the homeless people? Yes, you are able to provide them hotel accommodation. You can do it for 1 day, 2 days, maybe a week. But can you sustain that in the long run? You see? So these are things I think we need to be looking at and create a much more sustainable approach going forward as a organization in order to be more successful.
Okay.
I hope I
So
answered your question.
yes.
If you have
Yes.
any clarity, please feel free to.
We'll rebuttal when it comes to
Yeah.
that. I remember we watched a video in class about Condoleezza Rice and George Bush on
Yes.
communication, about how one thing said could be interpreted as another due to maybe cultural differences or not paying attention to someone. And that's what we see here. As you said earlier, the news is saying one thing, government is saying another thing. You go on social media, it's another thing. So I think also that communication is key, but is there like a strategy in how to communicate to people? Do you go straight to facts, or you kind of tone it down to the barest minimum so that people can relate?
I think it's good. As I said to you, I'm going to stick to what I said earlier. It's about being transparent
And
and to sticking to facts. And I think, again, social media sites like Facebook or Twitter and any other platforms need to take responsibility and ownership on what is being communicated, and telling people not to speculate. There's a lot of speculation which is happening. So, everyone is speculating about a lot of things. No one knows what is the exact truth, even in terms of death numbers. No one knows the accurate death numbers. It's all about speculation, and people don't know if these numbers are exaggerated or underreported. So no one is talking about it. So I think every person in this society has to play a role in ensuring the right and the correct information is being communicated. That's why WhatsApp, what they did was they said you can only forward a message only once, and they changed their settings, so on. So before, people, they were able to forward messages to hundreds of people, but then they brought it down to five, and now they've just made it one. So I think some organizations have taken some effort to try and minimize the number of or amount of information or speculative information or news which is being spread across. So I think it's important for leaders across levels, across sectors, to take, even individuals. I think, as I said, you don't need to have a formal role to be a leader.
yeah.
I think we all are leaders in our own right. I think for all of us to play our part in managing this pandemic, I think only a collective effort will help us to defeat this. I think not the just the sole leader's responsibility is going to help. I think it's very important for people to play a collective role in trying to deal with this pandemic.
But how can you so for example in Brazil, they've lost two health ministers because the president thinks one way, thinks they're exaggerating when it comes to COVID-19. And so he can't work well with them, whilst the health ministers want to kind of bring a lockdown or minimize interaction with people. The president says, no, you are hurting the economy. And also in China, there were stories where people, when they earlier heard about this disease, they kind of spoke out and they were criticized or imprisoned. Those are the news that are coming out. So, how can you lead as an individual or as someone in the middle of an organization or even a manager, not even a CEO? How can you lead in times like this when your top leader says something else, but you know for a fact that something is not right?
You have just supported what I said earlier. I said you need to take a collective approach. And if you don't take a collective approach, this is what's happening. So countries are more concerned about the economy. You know, they're not thinking. Individuals are the key to an economy, and their well-being is key to an economy. You can't focus on an economy just for 2 months or in the short run. You'll need to think about the long-term sustainability. So the well-being of individuals are critical. So I think this is really sad to see some leaders you mentioned, like in Brazil and China and even the United States, for example, who have just focused on their own individual priorities. And there has not been a consultative approach, and they're not working towards a common goal. And I'm sure because they're going in different directions, it's only going to cause more confusion, it's going to cause more derailment, it's going to have a huge impact, and it's going to take even much more longer for these economies to recover because their focus has been in a very short term focus. So I think you need to think about it in a much more practical sense and experiment and say how things are. Like if you see many countries in the world are going through different stages of coming out of the lockdown. So they're looking at stage one and saying, okay, what is the impact? So if you use the same UK's R number, okay, after this stage, has the R number gone above one or still below one? Or is it closer to one? Okay, if it's closer to one, then we need to be a little cautious about stage two of our, lifting restrictions. So they need to look at those variables and work. That's why I said you need to work with experts. You need to give autonomy and freedom. If you try and do what a scientist is doing, you're going to struggle. You know what I'm trying to say? So I think it's very, very important for leaders to empower people, to have counselors who can advise them and give them the right. And that's why it's important. Politics should stay out of this. I think in this time, in this time of need, I think they need to be very professional and they need to take the right approach and do what is right. And that's what we say: leaders do the right thing. You got to do what is right. So that's what you need to be thinking about.
But this is where the leader comes in. I'm talking about where you, the middle member, you know something to be a fact and you're trying. For example, there's this New York governor, I think he's called Andrew Cuomo. And so Andrew Cuomo is one person that has been seen to be given a lot of direction and clarity when it comes to COVID-19. Yeah. Today, actually, I saw him on BBC trying to show people how the test is taken. And he did it on live TV while a doctor came in and took a nasal droplet or something and then showed him that it's as easy as that. So you don't need to be scared about that. And that's one way he is doing it, even though some governors and sometimes even the president contradicts what he's saying. How can you lead in such a state? How can you get that boldness to still move ahead? Do you kind of resign like the health ministers in Brazil? Or do you march on and hope for the best?
I think you need to march on. As I said, resilience is the key. You can't leave. You can't, if you're, what can I say, the captain of a ship, you can't jump ship in the middle of a storm. You've got to make sure that even if it's going to cost your life, you get your ship and your co-inhabitants in the ship to safety. That's a critical part of a leader. So I think what the governor of New York is doing is really good because people have a lot of misconception on what these tests are about. They feel it's got to put a dip thing, one of the swabs deep into your throat, and that's really not very pleasant. And people are quite apprehensive. And the other thing is, people are also very apprehensive. They don't know if these tests are reliable, are they accurate? So there are a lot of different interpretations on what's happening out there. So I think it's good what the governor is doing by coming out and demonstrating it on live television, making people see what they would go through a test, and also encouraging more people to get tested, and also have a mechanism where that result is communicated to the patients, and a proper record keeping takes place. So I think what he's doing is really good. I think leaders need to go through this. And I think the governor of New York has done a fantastic job because, you know, he, there were people, like 2,000 people dying a day in a state. And that was not very nice at all for him, to emotionally see things, seeing people drop dead, and also to lead. And he was crying out for support from
Yeah.
federal government, and he didn't get the support he also wanted. So he was at times left alone to fend for himself. So I think with all those, he's done well. He's come out strong. I think the death rates have not dropped significantly. Number of the infection rates are going down, and I think this is down to testing. So I think you got to understand what you need to be doing at this right time. What is the important thing? Is it testing? Is it
Mm.
communication? Is what is it? So I think leaders have done a brilliant job. Especially the newer governor and other leaders in some countries who have really come out strong trumps. Like Italy is another good example. They went through tough times. What lessons can be learned from Italy? Spain went through a similar challenge. What lessons can be learned from Spain? All these sort of things can really, help people to see things and do things differently. So I think it's good to learn from good examples.
Yeah.
We talk about classroom learning on case studies. What can we learn? What
Now
can we
you're
take
doing
back?
it. Yeah.
How applicable that would be, and also adapting it to the context, as you said earlier, the culture, the system, the infrastructure. Does it aid? Does it support this? So asking all those questions and trying things out, that would probably help.
Yeah. Back on Andrew Kumo, he's one person that actually, why they say he's bringing clarity is, for example, he brought light into what is happening within the government when they didn't have ventilators or when they were ordering for masks. And it was like every state was kind of bidding for it. So it was kind of raising the prices up. And he said, we all could maybe come in a central organization or something and let one person buy it and then distribute it to us as much as we need, and that will not raise the prices. That would also speed up things. And so he's one person that I've been studying very much during the process.
Mm.
And I also want to ask about organizational culture. So, how can organizational culture, because everybody has a way of doing things, every company is different, whether it's big or small. How can a leader use that culture to kind of bring kind of guidance and success or performance in the organization in times like this?
Well, we don't have to go too far. Amazon is a great
Mm,
example today because in the US, they have decided as a company to produce PPE, those protective masks, and to sell to their employees, sorry, not employees, to sell to people at cost price, which is about $9 or $10. you know so they're not trying to take advantage. Oh wow, there's a need now, people are going to rush to buy these ppe, personal protective equipments. So it's a great way to try and maximize things. So I think what Amazon is doing is a brilliant thing. So I think any innovation, any decision stems from the culture of the organization, which
okay.
which probably tries to tell people, we are ready to adapt. you know so
Mm,
having a culture which is flexible enough to adapt to new approaches, and not having a focus on profitability would really help going forward as a company. So I think that's a fantastic example I can say, and also having a culture that could help people, as I said earlier, where people feel that they're part of the organization, they're empowered, they feel valued, they feel appreciated, and things like this will not, you know, have a huge impact on how they perform. So even if you look at organizations, they have always gone through small changes on a regular basis, but this has literally magnified things in a much more
yes.
bigger way. But then even through those changes, employees have played a critical role, critical part in helping those companies be afloat and to survive. So I think it's also a good way for leaders to look back on those changes. So what did we do? How did we perform? and how did we, do things well. So I think that's something I think you need to be looking at, going forward. So I think leaders need to have a role to play, and also help companies to perform better.
I wanted to ask about the Johari window,
Mm,
how we kind of use it to find your blind spot and your hidden, whatever is hidden in the organization. We also learned about the organizational iceberg, I think.
mm,
In this situation, you have a lot of unknowns,
mm,
a lot of things that you can't really decide on. You're waiting on government to make a decision.
mm.
You are trying to find ways to keep your employees or keep your company. How can Johari window in this help?
As I said earlier, it's about reflecting on what you're doing right or wrong, and or on the decisions you have made, and helping to identify your own blind spot by trying to undertake an exercise where you're engaging, getting people to engage more, provide more feedback. And that's why I said, having a much more interactive communication strategy would help. So you're not just saying things, but also you're getting information, and you're able to reflect on that information, and you're able to see, how different, or is there a disparity between what
Yeah.
you said and what people are wanting in order to be successful. You know, so that's something you need to be thinking as a leader. So I think feedback is so important. I
Yeah.
think leaders need to find different mechanisms to get people to communicate. So even if you look at people, because people have different personalities, people are going to respond very differently. So you could get people like, even if you look at what Toyota did very successfully, is to having suggestion boxes where people were encouraged to come and put in those ideas. And basically, most of their advancement, innovation, solutions came from people, employees. That's what helped Toyota as a company to be more successful. So I don't think we need to go very far from what successful organizations have done. I think leaders can find different mechanisms to engage people. As I said, making everyone an important stakeholder within the process, and getting people to contribute. So that would all help in trying to build an organization, a country or an organization which is going to survive and succeed
Mhm.
in the long run. And as I said to you, people look at, like as we talked about the organizational iceberg. Many leaders make decisions based on the 10% they can see and not the 90%. And I think that's what countries like Brazil are doing. Countries like China probably did, as you said earlier. And when Donald Trump is trying to do those things, but they're not looking at the 90%, the things, which is beneath. So that's why, you need to empower people. You need to, like, say, I know many organizations are telling their employees, we are not going to rush you to get back to work, even though the government has relaxed conditions.
Mm.
So we are going to make sure that it's absolutely safe for you to come back, and it's absolutely safe that you can work. We can create an environment where you can work maintaining that social distance. If we can't, then you can still continue to work from home. Some leaders have gone that extra mile to say things and to communicate things. So I think it's important to put the well-being of your employees at the forefront of any decision, or your stakeholders. I think if leaders can do that, I'm sure they would be able to manage it. I'm sure they won't get it right. This is not the perfect
Yeah.
formula, but then it's about reflecting. Okay, this is the decision I've done, or maybe not maybe make decisions on a very short-term basis. Okay, so let's now focus on how do we get from now till the middle or the end of June, or let's take it on a monthly basis, and then in June, what should we do? Maybe government policies will change,
Yeah.
approaches to businesses would change. It's a long time. 4 weeks is a very, very long time, you know, in especially in today's current climate. So I think having those short-term strategies, approaches could help leaders to fine tune their thing, and also gives them an opportunity to redeem themselves. So that is the one thing.
So we are making policies, we are making changes. And for example, for the furlough, it's not for everybody. Even for companies, it depends on, I think, your profit margin or something. There's a cutoff point. And sometimes it feels like we are making policies to cater for just the poor or the middle class. there was a time, I think it was Richard Branson, he came out and said the government needs to help out with this company, Virgin Atlantic, I think, bail him out because he can't sustain the company, I think. And when you look at these people, they are kind of employing majority of the population. So how can we also kind of cater for them, not think that they are rich and so they should be okay in this crisis? But we are all facing it.
Okay, so you mean catering to bigger organizations or
Big
smaller organizations? Bigger
organizations as well.
organizations. See, you just mentioned about Richard Branson,
Yeah.
and you can see many in literature talks about Richard Branson in terms of him being an ethical leader. And a lot of people question his approach of, oh, you are owning an island in the Caribbean, and how can why should you be asking for help? And I think there are two things to life. You have a personal life and your professional life,
Yeah.
and you got to look at the professional well-being of the organization. Yes, from a personal perspective, yes, I have worked, I have made my money, I have invested in this. Yes, and he's also and the beautiful thing he did was he said was, I'm willing to mortgage this island to pay, to release funds. I don't know if you've seen that information.
No, I
To
didn't
release
see.
funds for the company. But in the meantime, it will be useful if the government can also help,
Step in.
bail the company, because I think as leaders they can only do so much. But I think the government, I think even the furloughing system also was applicable to larger organizations, and a lot of large organizations did take this into consideration. But then, as you said, there was limits. It's about people, especially those who are self-employed, had to have been earning more than £50,000, or maybe filing returns on £50,000 of
Yeah.
profit or whatever,
Yeah.
and should have been in business for 2 or 3 years. So they brought in those they had to bring in those policies in place. If not, others would have abused
Yeah.
the whole goodness of the government. People who are not doing anything, maybe people who are in the gig economy. You know what's a gig economy, right?
Yeah.
People with 0-hour contracts, or people who are self-employed tradespeople
Yeah.
who work for cash in hand, and they don't declare their income, so they would have all jumped into this to claim. So there are people like that also, the black economy you talk about. So I think so they made it very transparent and more clear and more accessible for people who have genuinely been in business, who have paid their taxes, and who have contributed to the economy. And I think everyone who did that was taken good care of. So I think the government have done. I think the finance minister in this country has done a brilliant job. No one expected him to do that. No one expected the government to come up with
Yeah.
such policies,
Yeah.
because if that didn't happen, I'm sure there would have been chaos in this country today. It's not just the pandemic, but also all the other things. So I think what they did, I think the approach the government has taken so far has been good, but there are a lot of questions being asked on, on lifting this approach, the restrictions. So I think that's something organizations will have to work closely with the government and try and help government shape policies. So, for example, the government was also trying to propose having a 2-week quarantine period for anyone coming to the UK. And a lot of airlines and even the airport authorities said, if you bring that in, it's going to kill our industry. So already we are struggling. They're just trying to take, so it's about making government and the policyholders to have that sort of conversations with stakeholders who are going to be impacted, and having that conversation will really help companies to find a common. That's what it's important, to work for a common goal. If everyone can work towards a common goal, I'm sure they would be able to achieve greater things and succeed.
Yeah, I think it's important to set that common goal, and then we all know our role that we are
Yes,
playing.
absolutely. And also giving people the autonomy, and requesting them also to come up with, maybe a certain guidelines, certain frameworks. How can we work with you
Yeah,
and other businesses
exactly.
going forward? And I think
So
having
we
that
all,
clarity would really help.
yeah, then we all share in the success and the consequence of
Absolutely.
it,
Absolutely.
then there'll be lower criticisms, I should
Yes.
say, and more collaboration.
True.
I see.
I think that's
So
the
Dr.
critical thing to succeeding in this time of crisis. And if everyone can work towards that, if the government and the leaders and businesses are encouraged to work, as you said earlier, towards a common goal, I'm sure you'll come out very strong.
Sure.
As a country, as a community, as a business, and as individuals. You would come up very strong, and it'll build more, it'll unite people, and people will, and we will see a very different society going forward.
Perfect. We pray so. So finally, Dr. Gratien, we all know that this is going to give us a new normal. We are not returning to the way things are. What are the lessons that you would hope for us to take to going forward, and your final message to everyone listening?
I would suggest to build resilience, not to give up. It's very easy to give up. Sometimes it's very easy to preach, but not practice. But I think building that resilience is very important. Building an environment which fosters trust is critical in this time. So I think building a personality, building values where you can foster trust, and also adapting skills where you can, adaptability is so important in this day and age. And also focusing on soft skills and thinking on how we could work differently. And also it's important to think outside the box. And more than anything is to make sure that your values are not compromised. You stick to your, what can I say, your moral values, and you don't deviate from that. And you work collaboratively with people and making sure that and also fostering care, caring for people. I think trying to move towards being a more caring society, because I think before, pre-pandemic, it was more me, 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 me. What is there in me? I think moving away from that and focusing more on others and caring for people. I think that would be the best outcome once things settle down.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Dr. Gratien, for your time. I appreciate you being with us and wish you all the best.
Thank you, Eugenia, for giving me this opportunity to talk to you, and I really enjoyed the conversation.
All right. Thank you.